In this presentation, we will be discussing special education and the law. We will be covering different laws associated with special education, some key vocabulary terms, as well as ways that you can be supportive of a student with special needs in your classroom.
Hello everyone, my name is Amanda and me and my group partner Megan will be talking about laws regarding special education in the school system. IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, defines special education as specially designed instruction at no cost for the parents to meet the unique needs of a student with a disability. Now, special education encompasses the academic, physical, cognitive, and social emotional instruction offered to students who have one or more disabilities. The goal is to give special education students the skills needed to be successful in the general education classroom and to enable them to build on these skills to the point that services provided are no longer needed. And now I will talk to you a little bit more about some key vocabulary terms to think of whenever you talk about special education. Some key vocabulary when talking about special education include the following. ARD, which stands for Admission, Review, and Dismiss. This is a meeting that occurs to determine if a student is eligible under IDEA for special education, and it is the same group of people who develop the IEP for the student if they do happen to be eligible. The IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. An IEP is a document that contains the information of the student and how they may be accommodated, and other supports like assistive technology and individualized instruction. The next key vocabulary that we have is RTI, which stands for Response to Intervention. Now, you may have heard about RTI in your other classes, such as Adolescent Growth and Development, because RTI is a process that is used by teachers for all students and not just special education students. RTI is used in cases where students are struggling, and teachers use interventions in the classroom to help all students succeed. It is also a method to see if a student may have a learning disability that might qualify them for special education. Next, we have LRE, which stands for Least Restrictive Environment. LRE is a requirement by federal law that special education students not be removed from the general education classrooms. LRE means that special education students should be able to learn with other students who are not receiving special education. And lastly, we have FAPE, which stands for Free Appropriate Public Education. FAPE is a right for students with disabilities guaranteed by the IDEA. The right to FAPE is one of the most important rights for any student. The next thing I want to talk about is the IDEA. This was a law that was first established in 1975 to provide free, appropriate public education to children with disabilities. The law was later reauthorized in 1997 and was given the title IDEA, which stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Through the IDEA, schools are required to evaluate students who may have disabilities without charging the parents for the evaluation. Through every step of the process, the IDEA provides the parents with rights and protections that are described as procedural safeguards. This gives the parents the ability to have a voice when it comes to their children's education. And if a child is eligible under IDEA services, the school and the parents will have an ARD or ARD meeting to develop an IEP for the child. Disabilities served under IDEA may include autism, deafblindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, and more. Now, even if a student has one of these disabilities, it may not automatically qualify them for the IDEA. Eligibility for the IDEA for a student must mean that the student has one of the disabilities serviced under IDEA and, because of the disability, need a special education in order to progress in school.
Alrighty, now that we've learned a little bit about some specific vocabulary involving special education laws, let's have a little pop quiz. The first question is going to be,
What does ARD stand for? A-R-D. If you guessed admission, review, dismiss, then you got this correct. Now remember, ARD is a meeting that happens between the faculty and the parents of the child to determine if they are eligible for special education under IDEA. Now that I've mentioned IDEA, let's have that be the second question. What does IDEA stand for? If you guessed Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, then you got this correct. Remember, this was a law passed in 1975 that required schools to evaluate students who may have special needs at no cost to the parent. Alrighty, and our last question is going to be, what does IEP stand for? If you guessed Individualized Education Program, you got this one correct. And remember, this is the set of information that provides the student with accommodations that they may need, as well as any assistive technology that they may need as well. And that's the pop quiz.
Hi! Now that Amanda has discussed some of the legalities and key vocabulary regarding students with special needs, she has completely prepped us for learning how to work with these students with disabilities. As Amanda stated, there are some meetings and other legal things that you need to go through in order to figure out different types of accommodations for your students with special needs. Each student could have his or her own individual education plan, or IEP, which will be discussed throughout these meetings. Working with students with special needs requires a great amount of understanding, and you need to be able to accommodate your lessons for those in need. We want to make sure that these students have equal opportunities as the general education students. We want to make sure that they are still held at the same high standard, but we don't want to make them impossible standards for them. So in these next few slides, we will be learning the best ways to work with your students with special needs and how to accommodate for them. The first thing that we will be discussing is the 504 plan. 504 plans are meant for students who have difficulty reading, concentrating, communicating, standing, sleeping, speaking, or really anything that inhibits them from performing highly in their class. The point of the 504 plan is that it assures parents of students with disabilities that their student will receive fair treatment and education at school. In doing so, these plans require positive accommodations for students as they're educated along in regular general education classrooms. Now you may be thinking that that sounds pretty similar to an individual education plan, or IEP. And yeah, they're kind of similar, but there is a difference. An individualized education plan is provided to a student who needs modifications to their everyday classroom setting. They might receive different educational services such as special needs classrooms and monitoring by additional school staff. On the other hand, 504 students are integrated into general education classrooms and are monitored by classroom teachers. A student with an IEP can, however, get a 504 as well if they are working on transitioning into a normal classroom. Should a student with special needs need to be disciplined, there are a sequence of federal and state laws in place to ensure that the student is receiving caring instruction and that the school is enforcing procedures to protect the child's safety. There are a few disciplinary resources and steps that a teacher may need to take in order to provide fair treatment and appropriate discipline for a student with special needs. This brings us back around to the IDEA and IEPs. In order for a student with disabilities to be disciplined, the punishment must fall within the IEDA and within that student's IEP's standards. The first legality that classroom teachers and administrators need to be aware of is the 10-day rule. The IDEA requires state education agencies to review local education agencies' data annually to determine if a significant discrepancy in the long term, which is more than 10 days, suspension and expulsion rates can exist for a student with disabilities. This basically means that a student who gets suspended for more than 10 days must be suspended in compliance with their IEPs and not just through their school or placements administration. The next piece of important information that we will discuss is the written summary of restraint use. This written summary is regarding school, faculty, or officials needing to use restraint as a disciplinary measure. If they do, they must submit a written summary of the restraint used to be reported through PEIMS, or the Public Education Information Management System. Educators can learn more about these rules and more through the Texas Behavior Support Initiative. This is state training to provide knowledge of positive behavior interventions and support for all students. The TexasBehaviorSupport.org website has an abundance of information about the knowledge of laws in place to enforce care-based instruction and positive discipline to our students with special needs. It is important to accommodate for students with disabilities rather than modify for them. To provide fair treatment and education, a teacher must hold special education students to the same high standard as all of the other students. In doing so, we accommodate to put them on the same playing field as the other students. If we modified, we would be making learning easier for them and therefore holding them to a lower standard and changing our learning goal. Unless stated otherwise by the IEP, it's in your best interest to use accommodations rather than modifications. You may now be wondering what the difference between a modification and an accommodation is. Well, I have some examples for you. Some examples of modifications, or the changing of the learning goal, is having 2 answer choices on an exam rather than 4, making the student only create an outline rather than writing an entire essay, and having much easier grading standards than your general education students. While utilizing these modifications could make the student perform much better in your classroom, it does not provide them with the same fair, high expectation education that other students have and could put you in legal issues with the IDEA. Some examples of some accommodations that you can and should use includes verbal, visual, or technological aids, extended time on exams, and translation dictionaries. This way, the students are still completing the same work as the other students, but they just have an extra nudge of help along the way. Now, before we end our lesson, I am going to ask you guys just a couple discussion questions so that you can really make sure that your brain is wrapping around some of these issues. The first question is, what is an example of a situation in which you would need a written summary of restraint use? Number 1 could have many different answers. Some include if a student with special needs or disabilities got into a physical alteration with another student, you would need some sort of approach with restraint to make sure that the students don't get hurt or injure each other. Another example could be if a student with disabilities or a student with special needs had some sort of panic attack or instance like that, you might need to use a hands-on approach to comfort that student and make sure that they're being safe. And in instances like that, you would need a written summary of restraint use. Our second question revolves around a scenario. So, say that you have a student who is blind in one of your fine arts classrooms. What are some accommodations that you could use to help support this student? And on top of that, what are some things that could potentially be modifications that would not support the student? Some accommodations that you could find for a blind student in a fine arts classroom could be technological aids. So if there's a type of typing system that they can use Maybe you have created playbills or things like that with Braille, or explanations of art pieces with Braille. Maybe you have paired this student with another student who can physically help them feel the keys on different instruments and things like that. Those are all really great examples of accommodations. Now, for modifications, some things that might not be as beneficial and could be on the edge of illegal would be saying that they're not going to be graded as harshly because they're blind and they can't be walking around like that, or maybe you think it'll take them too long to take the exam, so you're just not going to have them take the exam, things like that. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. I hope that this information is beneficial to you as you begin your career in teaching.